Put your hands where I can see them, ma'am, now. The voice cut through the pharmacy like a siren no one could ignore, sharp, controlled, and just loud enough to make every head turn at once as Officer Daniel Brooks stood rigid near the counter, one hand resting near his belt, the other extended toward an elderly black woman who hadn't moved, not even an inch, her fingers still curled tightly around a small white paper bag as if it held something fragile, something irreplaceable. The fluorescent lights above casting a cold sheen across the polished tile floor and reflecting faintly in the glass display cases behind her, while the low hum of refrigerators filled the silence that followed, a silence that didn't feel calm, but suspended, like the entire room was holding its breath and waiting for something to break. A shopping cart squeaked to a halt somewhere near the greeting cards aisle. A child's whisper was quickly hushed, and the automatic doors at the front slid open with a soft mechanical sigh before closing again, letting in a brief gust of late winter air that carried the scent of asphalt and distant traffic, but none of it seemed to reach the center of the moment where Evelyn Carter stood, 72 years old, her gray curls tucked neatly beneath a worn knit hat, her coat slightly too thin for the season, her posture steady despite the tremor in her hands, her eyes not defiant, but not fearful either, just steady, as if she had already decided something long before this moment arrived. Brooks took a small step closer, his boots echoing lightly against the floor, and the faint crackle of his radio broke through for a second before going quiet again, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the bag she held, the one detail he couldn't ignore, the one detail that had drawn every ounce of his attention in the first place, because from where he stood it looked like hesitation, like guilt, like something not quite right. And he had learned not to ignore that feeling, not after years on the job, not after too many moments where waiting had cost too much. I said step forward. He added, lower this time, but no less firm, the words landing heavier in the stillness. And somewhere behind him a man shifted uncomfortably, pulling out his phone without thinking, the faint glow of the screen lighting up his face as others began to follow, quiet observers drawn into the gravity of a scene they didn't fully understand but couldn't look away from. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the bag, the thin paper crinkling just enough to be heard in the hush, and for a brief second her gaze dropped, not in submission, but in thought, before lifting again to meet his. The overhead lights catching in her eyes, revealing something deeper than the moment itself, something patient, something measured, as if whatever was about to happen next had already been weighed and accepted. The pharmacy tech behind the counter froze mid-scan, the red laser line hovering over a barcode without moving, while the digital clock above the register ticked forward in quiet indifference. 2:17 p.m. Another ordinary minute stretching into something else entirely, and still, no one spoke, no one moved, because the tension had settled into the room like a held breath that refused to release. And right at the center of it, between authority and quiet resistance, between assumption and truth, the distance between them felt smaller than a step, yet heavier than anything either of them had carried before. The paper bag in Evelyn Carter's hands was not new. Its edges softened from being held too long, folded once at the top with careful precision as though whoever packed it had done so with intention, not haste, and her fingers rested along that fold like they had memorized its shape. The faint tremor in her knuckles not from fear, but from age, from years that had carved patience into her bones, while the thin gold band on her left hand caught a sliver of light every time she shifted even slightly, a quiet detail that went unnoticed by everyone except perhaps the security mirror above aisle 3 that reflected fragments of the moment from a distance no one bothered to check. Her shoes were worn at the heels, sensible and clean, the kind chosen for walking more than appearance, and there was a faint scent of lavender that followed her, subtle enough to be missed unless someone stood close, the kind of scent that lingered from habit, from a life built on routines that did not change even when everything else did. She did not step forward when instructed, but she did not step back either, and that stillness was not resistance in the way people expected. It was something quieter, something steadier, like a line drawn long before this afternoon, long before this store, long before this uniformed man raised his voice. Her eyes moved once, briefly, toward the counter where a small digital screen displayed a total that had already been cleared, the receipt printer still holding a curled strip of paper that had not yet been torn free. And for a moment it seemed as though she might speak, but she did not rush it. She did not fill the silence just to ease it, because she understood something the others did not, that silence had weight, and if you held it long enough, it revealed more than words ever could. Behind her, a young mother tightened her grip on a toddler's hand, gently guiding him closer without drawing attention, while an older man near the vitamins aisle adjusted his glasses as if a clearer view might offer clarity to a situation that felt increasingly unclear. And still the phones remained raised, small glowing rectangles capturing fragments of a story, none of them fully understood. Evelyn shifted her grip slightly, the paper crinkling again, and this time the sound seemed louder, sharper against the stillness, drawing Brooks' attention back to the bag as though it were the center of everything, the object that justified the tension. The reason he stood where he stood, shoulders squared, voice firm, convinced that control was the same as certainty. But Evelyn's gaze did not challenge him. It met him with something else entirely, something that did not match the narrative forming in the room, something that did not align with suspicion or guilt. And that disconnect lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect chord. She took a slow breath, barely visible except for the gentle rise of her shoulders beneath the thin fabric of her coat, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, shaped by years of choosing her words carefully. "Officer, I am not trying to take anything that does not belong to me," she said, each word measured, each syllable steady, not defensive, not pleading, just true. And in that moment, something shifted, not in volume or movement, but in perception, like the first crack in a surface that had seemed solid just seconds before. Officer Daniel Brooks had been trained to read hesitation the way others read headlines, quick, instinctive, and rarely questioned. And from where he stood, everything about the moment aligned with that instinct. The stillness, the grip on the bag, the refusal to step forward when instructed, all of it fitting neatly into a pattern he had seen too many times to ignore. Yet there was something about this woman that did not sit right in that pattern, something subtle that pressed against the edges of his certainty, like a quiet contradiction he could not immediately explain. He shifted his weight slightly, the leather of his duty belt creaking under the movement, and his gaze flicked once toward the counter, toward the receipt printer, toward the technician who now stood frozen with both hands hovering above the register, as if afraid that even the smallest motion might disrupt the fragile tension that held the room together. And then his attention returned to Evelyn, narrowing just enough to signal that he was not finished, that whatever this was, he intended to see it through. "Then you will not have a problem showing me what is in that bag," he said, his voice measured, lower now, but carrying the same authority, the same expectation of compliance that came with the uniform he wore. And for a moment, the words seemed to settle into the space between them like a test neither of them had asked for, but both were now part of. Behind him, one of the bystanders cleared his throat quietly, shifting his stance as if preparing to speak, but ultimately deciding against it, while another adjusted the angle of his phone, zooming in just slightly, capturing the small details, the texture of Evelyn's coat, the way her fingers rested along the fold of the paper, the faint tremor that might have been mistaken for nervousness by anyone not paying close attention. Brooks had been up for nearly 20 hours, the weight of the past week pressing behind his eyes, the long nights at the hospital, the quiet beeping of machines, the conversations with doctors that never seemed to land where he needed them to, and that exhaustion threaded through his thoughts now, tightening his patience, sharpening his tone in ways he did not fully register, because in his mind this was simple, a situation to resolve, a question to answer, a line to draw clearly, so there would be no confusion about what was expected. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, not resistant, not submissive, just present, and when she finally moved, it was not in the way the room anticipated. She did not immediately hand over the bag, did not rush to comply out of fear or urgency. Instead, she adjusted her grip slightly, smoothing the top fold with her thumb as though ensuring it remained intact, a small, deliberate gesture that carried more meaning than it seemed. And then she lifted her gaze fully to meet his again, steady and unhurried. as if she understood that what mattered now was not speed but clarity. The hum of the refrigeration unit seemed louder in the silence that followed, the ticking of the wall clock more pronounced, each second stretching longer than the last. And somewhere near the entrance, the automatic doors opened again, letting in another brief gust of cold air that brushed against the back of Brooks' neck, grounding him just enough to notice the faint scent of lavender again, to notice the way Evelyn stood without shifting her feet, rooted not in defiance, but in something deeper, something that did not bend easily under pressure. "I do not mind showing you," she said finally, her voice calm, even, each word placed carefully as though she had chosen it long before this moment. "But I would like you to understand what you are looking at before you decide what it means." And that sentence, quiet as it was, did something unexpected. It did not challenge his authority. It did not question his role, but it introduced something else into the equation, something he had not accounted for, the possibility that what he thought he saw might not be the full picture. And for the first time since he had raised his voice, the certainty that had guided him into this moment shifted, just slightly, just enough to be felt. The words lingered between them, not loud, not forceful, but weighted in a way that made the air feel denser, as if even the fluorescent lights above had dimmed just slightly to listen, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it before he understood it. That subtle shift where control did not disappear but no longer felt absolute, where the script he had followed 100 times before no longer fit as cleanly as it should. His fingers tightened just a fraction at his side, not in anger but in reflex. The habit of holding ground when uncertainty crept in, and he gave a short nod, the kind that signaled permission without surrender. "Go ahead," he said, the words steady but carrying a trace of something less rigid than before, something closer to caution than command. Evelyn Carter did not rush, and that absence of urgency drew more attention than any sudden movement could have, her hands moving slowly, deliberately, as she unfolded the top of the paper bag with care, smoothing each crease as if the act itself mattered, as if respect for what was inside extended even to the way it was revealed, the soft sound of paper giving way filling the silence in a way that felt almost amplified, every small motion magnified by the stillness around them. A woman near the end of the aisle leaned forward slightly, her breath held without realizing it, while the man recording adjusted his grip again, the faint click of his phone case echoing like a distant tap in a quiet room. And behind the counter, the technician finally lowered her hands, not to move, but simply because holding them midair any longer felt impossible. Evelyn reached into the bag, her fingers disappearing for a brief second before emerging with a small rectangular box, white with blue lettering, the kind of packaging so ordinary it would have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here, in the center of this suspended scene, it carried a gravity that drew every eye toward it, and she placed it gently on the counter beside her, not sliding it, not dropping it, but setting it down with intention, as though placing something fragile into view. Brooks' gaze followed the movement instantly, narrowing not in suspicion this time, but in focus, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he expected, and for a moment neither matched, the box too simple, too ordinary, lacking the tension he had built in his mind. Yet he did not step back, did not retreat from the moment. Instead, he leaned in slightly, closing the distance by just enough to read the label more clearly, the overhead light reflecting off the glossy surface, catching the printed name in sharp contrast against the white background. Evelyn reached into the bag again, this time retrieving a folded receipt, its edges still curled from the printer, and she placed it beside the box with the same measured care, aligning it so that it faced outward, so that it could be seen without being touched, her movements steady despite the tremor that remained in her hands. And then she stepped back half a pace, not away from the situation but to give it space, to let what was now visible speak without interruption. "This is what I was bringing back," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him, just enough to reach the room, and there was no defensiveness in it, no urgency to prove anything, only clarity, the kind that does not demand attention but earns it. And as Brooks' eyes moved from the box to the receipt, tracing the printed lines, the total, the timestamp, something shifted again, deeper this time, not in the room, not in the crowd, but in him, where the certainty that had once felt solid now showed its first real fracture. The label came into focus slowly, not because it was unclear, but because his mind resisted what his eyes were already reading. The clean printed text sharp under the pharmacy lights, the name of the medication unmistakable, the dosage precise, the kind of prescription that did not belong to impulse or confusion, but to something serious, something planned, and beneath it, printed in smaller letters, the patient name, aligned perfectly on the line where it should be, where it had always been, and yet now it felt out of place in a way he could not immediately explain. Officer Daniel Brooks leaned closer without realizing it, the faint scent of antiseptic and paper rising from the counter as he did, his breath slowing just slightly as the details settled in, and then his eyes shifted to the receipt beside it, tracing the timestamp, the total amount, the confirmation line that read paid in full, each word landing heavier than the last, each number pressing against the version of events he had already formed in his head. Behind him, the quiet murmur of the store had not returned. It remained suspended, held back by something unspoken, as if the room itself understood that whatever was happening now had not yet reached its conclusion, and the people watching sensed it too. Their phones still raised, but their expressions no longer certain, no longer aligned with the assumption that had filled the air just minutes before. Brooks' jaw tightened, not in anger but in recognition of something slipping, something shifting beneath the surface of what he thought he understood, and his hand hovered briefly above the counter before pulling back, choosing not to touch the items, not yet, as if distance might somehow preserve the clarity he was trying to regain. Evelyn stood where she had stepped back, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, no longer gripping the bag, her posture unchanged, steady, patient, as though she had seen moments like this before, moments where perception lagged behind truth, where realization came slowly, not with noise but with weight. "You said you were returning it," Brooks said, his voice quieter now, less certain, the words forming more as a question than a command, and even as he spoke them, he felt the gap between what he had assumed and what was now in front of him widen, just enough to be impossible to ignore. Evelyn nodded once, a small, measured motion. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone unchanged, calm and even. "I brought it back because there was a mistake," and that word, mistake, settled into the space between them with a quiet gravity, not accusatory, not defensive, just factual. Yet it carried implications that extended beyond the counter, beyond the box and the receipt, reaching into the moment itself. Brooks glanced again at the receipt, this time slower, more deliberate, his eyes catching on a detail he had not fully registered before, the line beneath the total, the one that listed the purchaser, the name printed there not matching the patient, not matching the assumption that had driven him to raise his voice, and for a fraction of a second, something inside him stilled completely, like a mechanism pausing mid-motion. The overhead lights hummed softly, the clock ticked forward another second, and in that fragile space between what was seen and what was understood, the tension did not break, it deepened, shifting from confrontation into something heavier, something that pressed inward rather than outward. As the first real crack in certainty widened just enough to let doubt through, and once it entered, it did not leave. The word mistake did not echo loudly. It did not demand attention, but it settled into the room with a quiet permanence that no one could ignore, and for a long second no one moved. Not the customers, not the technician, not even the automatic doors that seemed to pause between cycles as if the building itself had chosen to listen. Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the receipt, but he was no longer reading it. He was absorbing it, letting each detail sink past the surface where instinct usually lived and into a place that required something slower, something more deliberate, and his breathing shifted, barely noticeable except for the slight rise and fall of his chest, a rhythm that had lost its earlier edge. The printed name on the purchaser line lingered in his mind, unfamiliar at first glance, but now refusing to leave, pressing against something deeper, something tied not to the moment in front of him, but to the past few days, the long hours under fluorescent hospital lights, the quiet conversations with nurses who spoke in careful tones, the folded bill statements he had not yet figured out how to manage, and for a brief instant the pharmacy around him. Blurred, not visually but emotionally, replaced by the memory of a bedside chair that had become too familiar. Evelyn Carter did not interrupt that silence. She did not fill it with explanation or urgency. Instead, she allowed it to exist, her hands resting lightly against the fabric of her coat, her posture unchanged, as though she understood that some realizations could not be rushed, that forcing them into words too quickly would only weaken their meaning. The hum of the refrigeration units continued, steady and indifferent, while somewhere behind the counter a machine clicked softly as it reset, a small mechanical sound that seemed louder than it should have been, marking time in a space where time itself felt stretched. Brooks' eyes moved once more across the receipt, slower now, tracing the letters of the purchaser's name, letting them settle fully, and as they did, the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly, not disappearing but shifting into something heavier, something closer to recognition than resistance. He exhaled quietly, the breath leaving him slower than it had before, and for the first time since he had raised his voice, his focus was no longer on control, no longer on asserting authority, but on understanding, on reconciling the difference between what he had believed and what was now undeniably present. Evelyn glanced briefly at the box on the counter, then back to him, her expression unchanged, calm, patient, not waiting for an apology, not demanding acknowledgement, simply present in the moment as it unfolded, as if she had already accepted whatever would come next. The people watching began to shift slightly, not leaving, not speaking, but adjusting their stance, their attention no longer fixed on a confrontation but on something quieter, something more complex, and the phones that had been raised moments before now felt less certain, their purpose less clear. Brooks straightened just a fraction, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught somewhere in between, and when he finally looked up from the receipt to meet Evelyn's gaze again, there was a difference there, subtle but undeniable, the sharp edge of assumption. Softened, replaced by something more uncertain, more human, and in that quiet exchange, with no raised voices, no sudden movements, the moment shifted fully into stillness, not empty, but full, heavy with understanding that had not yet been spoken but could already be felt. The name did not just sit on the receipt anymore, it settled into him, threading through memory with a precision that made his chest tighten in a way he could not ignore, because he had seen it before, not here, not on paper, but on a clipboard clipped to the end of a hospital bed, printed in the same clean typeface, beneath the same patient name he had memorized without realizing it, his mother's name, Linda Brooks. And for a moment the pharmacy around him seemed to fall further away, the hum of machines replaced by the quiet beeping he had listened to for hours, the sterile smell of antiseptic and plastic, the weight of conversations that always ended with numbers he could not quite reach. His eyes dropped back to the receipt, slower now, almost careful, tracing the purchaser line again as if hoping it might change, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something easier to accept, but they did not. They remained exactly where they were, clear, undeniable, Evelyn Carter. And beneath that, a timestamp that aligned too closely with the moment he had stepped out of the hospital to take a call he did not want to answer, the moment he had been told to consider options he could not afford to consider. His throat tightened slightly, not enough to show, but enough for him to feel, and when he looked up again, the distance between him and the woman in front of him felt different, not measured in feet but in understanding, in the gap between assumption and truth that had just been bridged without a single raised voice. Evelyn did not step forward, did not explain beyond what had already been shown. She simply met his gaze with the same steady calm, her eyes holding no accusation, no expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement that he now saw what she had known all along. Behind him, the faint shuffle of movement returned, not loud, not disruptive, but present, as the people watching began to shift their weight, their attention no longer fixed on suspicion but on something deeper, something that felt less like a spectacle and more like a moment they had not meant to witness. Brooks inhaled slowly, the breath catching just slightly before settling, and for the first time since the moment had begun, he did not feel the need to speak immediately, because the words that had once come easily now felt insufficient, too small to hold what had just unfolded. His hand moved again, this time, not hovering but resting lightly against the edge of the counter, grounding himself in something physical as his mind worked to reconcile the image he had formed with the reality in front of him, the reality that the woman he had confronted, The woman he had questioned had done something he had not been able to do, something he had not even known had been done. The overhead lights continued their steady glow, unchanged, indifferent, but the atmosphere beneath them had shifted entirely, the sharp edge of tension replaced by a quiet weight that pressed inward rather than outward. And in that stillness, the truth did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It settled gently, firmly, leaving no space for doubt, only recognition, only the unmistakable realization that the moment had turned completely and irreversibly, and that he was no longer standing in control of it, but inside of it. The silence did not break all at once. It loosened slowly, like a grip releasing without anyone noticing the exact moment it changed, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it in the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, in the way the tension in his jaw eased without permission, because there was nothing left to hold on to, no assumption left to defend, only the quiet weight of what had just been revealed. And for the first time since he had stepped forward, his voice did not come easily. It did not arrive with certainty or command. It waited, forming carefully as if each word needed to earn its place. "Miss Carter," he began, the name unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, not because he had not read it, but because saying it now meant acknowledging everything that came with it, and he paused, not searching for authority but for honesty, something he had not needed just minutes before but could not avoid now. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, her posture unchanged, not stiff, not guarded, simply present, and she did not step closer, did not create pressure for him to continue. She allowed the space to remain open, as if understanding that whatever came next had to come from him alone. Brooks exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted completely. No edge, no command, only something quieter, something more human. "I did not realize," he said, then stopped, because the sentence felt incomplete, too small to carry what it needed to, and for a brief moment he looked down at the counter again, at the receipt, at the name that had changed everything, grounding himself in the reality of it before finishing. "I am sorry," he added, the words simple, unembellished, but heavier than anything he had said before. The apology did not echo, it did not draw attention, but it moved through the room with a quiet clarity that reached everyone standing there. And for a second the people watching seemed unsure what to do with it, their phones lowering slightly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something closer to reflection, because this was not the moment they had expected to witness. Evelyn inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the words without dramatizing them, without turning them into something larger than they were. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm steadiness it had held from the beginning. "You could not have known," she said, not to excuse, not to dismiss, but to place the moment in its proper context. And there was no bitterness in it, no quiet accusation, only a simple truth that allowed the moment to settle rather than fracture. Brooks looked at her then, fully, not as a situation, not as a question to resolve, but as a person he had misread, and the realization did not come with defensiveness. It came with clarity, with the understanding that the line between authority and assumption had been thinner than he had believed, and that he had crossed it without seeing it. His hand moved. Again, this time reaching toward the box on the counter, not to take it, but to steady it, to ensure it remained exactly where it was, as if that small gesture could somehow honor what it represented. And then he stepped back half a pace, creating space where before he had closed it, a subtle shift that changed the entire shape of the moment. The hum of the store returned gradually, not fully, but enough to remind everyone that time had not stopped, that the world beyond this interaction still existed, and yet something within it had changed, something quieter, deeper, as the weight of what had just unfolded settled into place, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a stillness that felt complete. The moment did not end with a sound. It dissolved into something softer, something quieter, like the final note of a song that lingered just long enough to be felt before fading into stillness. And Evelyn Carter reached for the paper bag again, her movements as careful as they had been from the beginning, folding the top once more with the same deliberate precision, not rushing, not lingering, simply completing what she had come to do, while the box and the receipt remained on the counter for a second longer. as if even they needed time to settle into what they now represented. Officer Daniel Brooks did not move to stop her, did not step forward or speak again. He simply watched, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer pressing against the space but existing within it, quieter, more aware, his eyes following the small details he had missed before, the steadiness of her hands, the calm in her expression, the absence of any need to prove what had already been made clear. Behind them, the store began to breathe again, softly at first, a cartwheel turning, a whispered exchange near the greeting cards, the faint beep of a register resuming its rhythm, life returning not with a rush but with a gradual easing, as though everyone present understood that something had shifted and did not want to disturb it too quickly. One by one, the phones lowered, not out of instruction but out of instinct. The need to capture the moment replaced by the quiet realization that it had already passed into something more personal, something that did not belong on a screen. Evelyn lifted the bag gently, holding it close but not tightly, and for a brief second her gaze moved past Brooks, toward the automatic doors at the front of the store, where the late afternoon light filtered through the glass, soft and pale against the polished floor, a reminder that the world outside continued as it always had, unchanged and yet somehow different. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, his hand falling away from the counter, and though he did not speak, there was a subtle acknowledgement in the space he gave her, in the way he stepped just enough to clear her path without drawing attention to it, a quiet gesture that carried more meaning than any additional words could have. Evelyn walked forward at her own pace, measured, steady, her footsteps light against the tile, passing him without hesitation, without pause. And as she did, the faint scent of lavender lingered, briefly in the space between them before fading into the air, leaving behind only the memory of it. The doors opened with their soft mechanical sound, letting in a cool breeze that brushed against the floor and stirred the edge of a receipt left behind on the counter, lifting it just slightly before it settled again, the printed lines still visible under the steady light. Brooks remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze following the movement of that small piece of paper, the name still clear, the reality still present, and in that quiet, with no audience left watching closely, no voices demanding resolution, he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a weight that felt different now, not heavy with tension but with understanding. Outside, Evelyn stepped into the fading daylight, her figure blending into the rhythm of the street, while inside, the store returned to its ordinary cadence. The hum of machines, the soft conversations, the quiet movement of people going about their lives. And yet beneath it all, something remained, not visible, not spoken, but felt, like a stillness that had settled into the space and would not easily be forgotten.